Being a convert to the Catholic faith, I suppose it's kind of self-serving to say that very often converts make the best Catholics. So let me confess right away that I consider myself a lamentable exception to that rule. Fortunately, the history of the Church is replete with examples of people like John Henry Newman, the famous 19th century Anglican, a convert from the Church of England to Catholicism, slated to be canonized later this year, and St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, better known as Edith Stein, a convert from Judaism and a martyr of Auschwitz. A much lesser known convert of the late 19th and early 20th century was an Englishman named Robert Hugh Benson. His father was Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Anglican Communion. So his conversion to Catholicism caused quite a stir. Robert Hugh Benson died fairly young, but he left behind a large body of written work, many of his books still in print. One, a novel called Lord of the World, that's a favorite of Pope Francis. Another, a delightful little volume called The Friendship of Christ, in which he asserts, near the beginning of his reflections, if there is anything clear in the Gospels, it is this: that Jesus first and foremost desires our friendship. And the consciousness of this friendship is the very secret of the saints. Friendship with Christ. It should be second nature to us Catholics. How many tokens of Christ's friendship we've been given. The teachings of the Church to guide and safeguard us on our way. Fellowship with the saints as companions on our journey. The sacraments which give us a share in Christ's life, increasing it and restoring it when we've sinned and strayed. So many beautiful devotions to the Sacred Heart, the Divine Mercy, the Rosary. And as if all this weren't enough, Jesus deigns to remain in our tabernacles and to show himself in the monstrance, so that, like true friends, we can spend time with him, basking in his divine presence, his real presence in the Eucharist. Yet with all this, somehow it seems to come more naturally to many of our born-again Christian friends and evangelical Christian brothers and sisters to spontaneously enter into a relationship of friendship with Christ than it does to us Catholics. I can't help but think that that saddens the heart of Jesus. I've been a priest for more than 40 years now. I've served in 4 parishes and 2 seminaries. Unfortunately, I've been blessed to see beautiful and unforgettable expressions of friendship with Jesus in each of these places. And they've become an incentive to me not to let Jesus down in his desire that we be friends. In my first assignment as a priest, we had a huge First Communion class my first year there. 400 children for First Communion. In fact, that happened several years in a row. And we'd do all of those communions in 2 sessions, 200 at a time. One of the little girls preparing for her communion had Down syndrome. She was hyperactive in her religion classes, and she had us wondering if she were getting anything at all of what we were trying to teach her. She had us wondering if she was really ready for First Communion and what she might do in the middle of a communion mass. After much discussion and with some prodding by her mother, we went ahead and allowed her to participate in one of these 2 large sessions, 100 girls on one side and 100 boys on the other. All the girls in white, all the boys in blue suits. I was a nervous wreck, wondering how this was all going to go. She received at the end of the line. She did so very reverently. And then, as she crossed in front of the church to return to her seat, she stopped, looked over all the other girls in the first 9 or 10 pews, caught the eye of her mother, and said for all the church to hear, "God in me." That little girl was a friend of Jesus. She knew what the Eucharist was about. In another parish assignment, we began round-the-clock Eucharistic adoration in what was once the baptistry of the church. We turned it into a small adoration chapel, and we were able to get volunteers to fill in 1-hour slots from Tuesday morning, again round the clock, all the way till Friday morning. Understandably, the toughest hours to fill were from midnight to 6 a.m. That was the limiting factor in how many days we could go. I used to take a 3 to 4 a.m. hour each week, and I was followed from 4 to 5 by a woman who came from several parishes away, usually with 1 or 2, sometimes with 4 or 5 friends. But it was she who caught my attention and fascinated me. She'd get there early, so our time overlapped. She'd come into the chapel. She'd kneel down before the Blessed Sacrament. And then she would bow her head until it touched the floor. And she would remain like that for a minute or more. Then she'd lift her head, pray a while longer while kneeling, and only after all of that, take a seat and spend the rest of the hour in the presence of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament. She was originally from South America, in her 30s or 40s, I'd say, and often a daily Mass goer. About a year before I left that parish, she was diagnosed with cancer. She was perfectly calm about it and continued to come to adoration at that 4 to 5 a.m. hour, unless chemotherapy made her too sick to come. I honestly don't know what became of her. Don't know whether she's still alive or went home to God. She was alive when I left there. But alive or dead, I'm confident that that woman was and is a true friend of Jesus. And thinking about her with her head touching the floor in front of Jesus, praying so devoutly, she remains an inspiration to me and an incentive to pray for deeper devotion to and love of Jesus in the Blessed Sacrament, and an incentive to become a better friend of Jesus. During my next assignment, through an extraordinary series of coincidences, I discovered a little-known chaplain to a convent of Visitation Sisters in England. I made contact with him and through his friend and publisher, actually got to go to England and meet him at his cottage in the English countryside. His name was Father John Keep. That's K-E-E-P. And you can learn all about him, read or listen to his homilies or conferences at a website in his honor, www.fatherjohnkeep, all written out long, no abbreviations. Father Keep said Mass with great tenderness, simplicity, and love. Spent at least an hour every day in prayer before the Blessed Sacrament. One of the sisters at the convent told me that seeing Father in the presence of the Blessed Sacrament was a religious experience in itself. In one of his conferences, he tells in a parable that he made up of a man who offers the woman he loves the thing most precious to him next to her in all the world, only to have her spurn his gift. The man, it turns out, was Jesus. The gift, himself in the Eucharist. The woman, the church, the people of God. On the recording of this conference, you can hear Father Keep break down in the middle of the story. It broke his heart to think of how ungrateful Jesus' friends are for the gift of himself that he gives us in the Eucharist. In a calmer, more theological frame of mind, he said that our celebration of the Eucharist is always to be thought of inseparably as a sacrifice, a sacred meal, and the real presence of Jesus. But he'd be the first to stress that this great gift and mystery is always more than we can say. It's always more than any theologian can write about. We may have to try to put into words what it all means, but our words will always fail. Our senses fail. Our intellects fail. Our emotions fail. We can never appreciate this greatest of gifts enough. It's always more than we can grasp. That said, I think that little Down syndrome girl making her first communion, in her uninhibited simplicity, came close to grasping it, the great mystery of Jesus' love for us in the Blessed Sacrament. That woman with her head bowed to the floor, I think she too came near to grasping the significance, the inner significance of this treasure that Jesus bequeaths us. And my late friend, Father John Keep, humbly offering Mass at the Visitation Convent or transfixed by the presence of Jesus in the tabernacle, or breaking down at the thought of human ingratitude in response to such a blessing, such a gift. He approached the truth of how great a gift we've been given. God has given us so many gifts in this life. How many we take for granted. None more than the greatest of all his gifts, himself in the Eucharist, given that we might receive him, given that we might adore him. Remember then what I'm about to say. Remember it if you don't remember anything else I've said. Remember it when you think of your family, your friends, the church, our nation. Remember it especially when you think of the Eucharist, this most precious of all God's gifts. This is what I want you to remember. What we take for granted will be taken from us. Why? Because there's hardly any sin, maybe none, worse than ingratitude. Don't take the Eucharist for granted. Be a friend of Jesus. Know that he is your friend. God grant us all a deep love of and devotion to Jesus in the Eucharist. God bless and keep you all.